Welcome to Dead Serious, the show where we talk about death without pretending or not a little bit awkward about it, but we're bringing full transparency so that people can learn a little bit more about death. So we're stripping away a little bit of that demystification. So I'm Crystal, founder of Renity, where we're bringing the human and practical infrastructure where families need before, during, and after loss. And today I'm joined by Dara Kosberg. She is someone that I'm super, super excited to talk to because you genuinely bring this kind of vibrant force into this overall industry that's seemingly gray. Because one, you are a founding team member of the dinner party as well as Reimagine, which is a super fascinating origin story. So Reimagine was a end of life festival, and it's basically the whole origin of it is around death, grief, loss, and finding meaning. And living fully is also the model that you're living and pitching your career into. You are a storyteller, and already I feel like we're talking about all of these things that make death less taboo. So many burning questions for you. You certainly blaze a trail in San Francisco as well as New York, with hundreds of events. So I can't imagine the level of stories that you kind of have experienced in yourself and cross path with, and even with your own loss. So with that being said, I'd love to welcome you here. And let me start with one question, which is, how did you get into this industry?
Yes. So I can say I was not someone who
Yeah.
was like, I don't know, obsessed with death or like I'm not goth. I don't know, like if you think about some of the stereotypes that you might see, it was something that happened quite organically and was through friendships that I ended up getting into the grief space. So I lost my mom when I was 20 years old and she had breast cancer. I knew that at some point she would die, but when she died, it was pretty shocking. It was kind of like I get a call while I'm studying abroad in Australia that she's going to die in a few days. And so I sort of both had the anticipatory grief of like knowing it's going to happen, and then also a little bit of the trauma. It was a little traumatic, shocking. And, at the time I was an artist and a visual artist. And so a lot of the processing that I did was done through my art. I had one very close friend who had also lost a parent and was a great support. But I
Mm.
would say that I navigated it mostly by myself. And it wasn't until about 10 years later when a former colleague of mine reached out and asked me to host a dinner party with her, where we would invite other people who had also lost a parent to talk about this. And I really didn't think I'd have much to say at the dinner. The way I described it is that I was a little broken and learned to live around the break. And didn't really get that I was actively still living with this loss. And so, but at the dinner, I actually had so many things to say. I mean, there was changing family dynamics, my own relationship with my mortality and how that had
Hmm.
been affected, sort of that loss of trust that things are going to be okay. And how that impacted choices, and also how it had impacted me in positive ways, in the sense that, like, I knew that life was finite from a very young age. And so I was like a yes person. I've always been like, let's do it if I can do something. And so it sort of made me very aware that, one, I was living with still loss in many ways, and also what a comfort it was to be with other people who had also lost a parent, and that, like, how having this community really changed
Hmm.
my relationship with the isolation that I felt from having lost a parent young. But also I saw the strength that these people had. Like, it's like when other people were sharing their stories, it was so visceral to me that these were not broken people. These were like incredibly strong, like loving, powerful people. Like, you could just feel their hearts. And then I was like, oh wait, I'm actually quite similar to them. And so then it started shifting this idea of my like brokenness to like fullness and openness. And so anyways, that was sort of my entree into this world. And then that led me to help get turn these dinner party groups into an organization, which then led me to Reimagine. And it was back in 2016 before Reimagine was like a full-blown organization. It was a project of Open IDEO, the IDEO, the human-centered like design company. They have this open platform called Open IDEO, where they crowdsource different environmental and social ideas to address different social and environmental issues. And they had one on redesigning the end of life. And that's when like Brad Wolf came up with this idea of this festival. So the first time I did it, I actually put on a dinner party instead of just for like people in their 20s and 30s, an intergenerational dinner party to talk about community support in times of loss, and like kind of when individuals or communities showed up for you, or didn't. And it was a really beautiful event. And I just loved the whole festival as a whole. And so then
Amazing. Well, thank you
when
so much
Brad
for sharing
turned it
that
into
origin
an
story.
organ,
And so grief is absolutely the intention of this episode, and I love to dive deeper in with you because, but one thing is for sure, right? Like you mentioned, grief is a universal emotion. Grief is truly it's a universal human experience, right? But our system treat it like it's a almost like a private inconvenience. And so this question for you is more, if grief touched so many people in the similar way, why do we act like, that it should happen quietly, privately, and almost that there is a timestamp that expires, right?
well, so it's interesting. I think that there's a misunderstanding around the idea that people don't want to talk about it. In my experience, I mean, and sometimes it's been like first dates where it's like I mentioned this and I'm like, look, I don't actually want to. I mentioned I work in the grief space, and all of a sudden they're telling me about their loss or whatever. And I'm like, but it's like people actually do want the invitation, I think. And when you give them the invitation, I think the problem is that there's just not enough invitations and there's not a normalizing of it. And so therefore people, especially,
Mm,
who are new to maybe having a
mm.
loss, they can see it can seem as
I don't want to
if
seem like a
nobody
burden
wants to
either,
talk about it
right?
because there's not the modeling that is
Other
happening.
people.
And I think, but yes, but the thing is, it's like everyone is carrying grief in some way, shape, or form. But it's like it's one of these things. Yes, it's like people feel like, oh, by me talking about it, I'm going to burden somebody, rather than actually you're giving them an invitation to open up their own hearts and to touch their own grief, and be actually able to process and release and to move. It's like what I've found in, having been in this world for a
Mm.
long time is like
Ooh,
the resistance to
resistance to
grief
grief.
is a lot
Okay.
more exhausting than actually feeling it. And grief. And along those lines, I mean, I think, when I was working for the dinner party, I helped start a program on helping grieving employees. So we were like working with different workplaces. And I interviewed tons of people who had different types of experiences in their workplaces around grief support. And what I found overwhelmingly is that the places where the managers and the leaders were very understanding, very flexible with how people showed up at work, or if they needed to work from home, or if they needed to take a couple hours out of the day to go take a walk because, to let that person who had just had a recent loss, those people were able to, I don't want to say recover, but be able to engage more effectively in their work. All of that energy meant that they couldn't spend it on their work. Whereas like people that could show up and just be themselves and have, space to like feel when they needed to feel,
Mhm. And
that meant that they
that
had
is
other
such a
energy to
good,
actually engage
you
with.
know, reason why communities that are collectively coming together under a common umbrella is such a removal of that waste energy of like guessing, am I being this, and that, where you're already stepping into a safe space. I think this dinner party is so tremendous in that way, as well as Reimagine. And let's talk a little bit more about Reimagine because you know, you as a program director at Reimagine, which again is a community and festival platform changing how people are facing death, grief, life's hardest transitions through storytelling, comedy, ritual, and public conversation. I mean, what an amazing way of a festival, right? Like, because generally when people think about festival, it's a music festival, it's a movie festival. But yeah, this is fascinating. Tell us a little bit more about the origin of Reimagine. And again, I've never heard of it. And what better person to talk a little bit more about this than you? Yeah.
Yeah, I can speak to kind of like how we started and then what we're now focused on and how we're doing this work in different ways. So yeah, so we started out by putting on these large community 10-day long festivals in San Francisco and New York called Reimagine End of Life. And the idea was trying to like activate all different types of spaces, from like hospitals to libraries to comedy like clubs to music halls to parks. And the arts were a big part of it because we believe that the arts are a wonderful gateway into hard conversations. It's kind of like when you just kind of rip something open and say, like, talk about your grief. It's like, it's hard for people who have never done it. And so when I talk about invitations to these conversations, the arts offer such a wonderful, like, slant in where people can experience somebody else's like grief or be provoked to explore their own in different ways, but it's in a, I think, a sort of a gentler format. And you know, we would have hundreds and hundreds of events that were both organized by our team, our programmatic team, but also the vast majority were put on by different partners, both organizations and individuals who are inspired to do this. And what happened during these festivals was magical because it's like, again, you think that because it's an end of life focus, that it's going to be maybe depressing or sad. And of course, there were sad moments. I mean, people are sharing real things, but I can say that overwhelmingly, the feeling at these events and what happened afterwards and the connections that were made were truly joyful. And I think where it's like people were able, they were in a safe space to actually share in a real way of what they've been like carrying. And when you have that kind of connection, I believe joy follows. I mean, it's like joy and love and all of the things. It's like the grief and is almost like the fastest way to like build like meaningful connection
Hmm.
by when you, because again, even if people have had very different types of losses, there is a universality to grief that can really connect people. So we did that up until the pandemic, and we had to like cancel our New York festival, which was supposed to be in June of, or yeah, I think in June of 2020. And so we quickly moved everything online, and became an open platform for different events around end of life and living more fully. And then for the past couple years, we have been developing, which is still in, I even think pre-beta, like a platform for healing and growth that's built on the science of post-traumatic growth. So the idea that you can take your hardships and channel them, not just to like
Yeah.
getting back to where you were, but actually living a fuller life through these experiences,
Yeah,
not through
honestly, that's so
the
beautiful.
grief
I mean, what
and
a
not by
great
bypassing it, but actually
concept,
going through
right?
it.
And I'd love to hear some of the stats, like how many people attended at the pre-pandemic era, and what were the demographic of people who attended? You know, like who were they?
So, I mean, we had close to about 10,000 people attend the festival, which, you know, is quite a lot. Thinking about getting people there. And also, you know, we're a nonprofit. So it's like not, you know, we had a marketing budget, but I mean, the fact that people were showing up, you know, and each year that it would grow. And I mean, the people that showed up were very reflective of the organizations and the people that were putting on events. And so that was where, like, for my program team, what we focused mainly on was outreach into other communities of all different types, across, you know, gender, religion,
All walks of life.
ethnicity, like, you
Yeah.
know, any, you know, trying.
It sounds like grief is a large demographic that attended. How were you guys able to reach audiences for them to find out about you? Or was it organic? Was it, what were some of the messaging that you had?
I
Mm,
mean, I think it was a lot of it was word of mouth.
mm,
So there was like that what we were trying to do was meeting people where they're at. So for example, like I produced a comedy show at the Punchline in San Francisco. Now, half the people that came were people from Reimagine that had learned about it on the website or, you know, were interested in the grief part. Then there was another half of people who came because, oh, Chris Garcia is performing. I love Chris Garcia. And so the idea was trying to go into spaces where we weren't just going to be, I don't want to like preaching to the choir in the sense that like people that were all like on board for these conversations. It was like, how can we go into spaces, community centers, other like spaces where there are people there, they do want to participate in a program, but aren't necessarily like actively looking for grief. Then there were people that like, oh my gosh, like this is their world maybe, and they've been kind of in a silo and they're excited to be part of something bigger. And so that's why they're coming. So it was really a very
Melting pot. Yeah, sounds like.
faceted kind of approach. The other thing was like, but yeah, and trying, we would have a big opening night at the SF Jazz Center, and we would try to get some speakers who had some followings, and so that they could be a good hook to kind of get people to come. So it was a lot of different things, and some people, what was exciting was that somebody might come for a comedy show and then they're like, oh my gosh, wow, that was really powerful, like to have, to explore grief through humor. And then they would learn about, oh, there's
Yeah,
all these other events
absolutely.
this
I
week.
mean,
So they would go to something
it's
that they
just
never would have
incredible
learned
to
about
hear
otherwise.
a different lens than, the traditional way of coping with grief. And I think a lot of people, 10,000 is super strong of a number, but I can't imagine, with just the rest of the nation having such a vast majority of people and under the subculture of just not coping with grief in the way that grief should be, being a community matter and all of that. So, and I love to shift the lens and talk a little bit more about, obviously there's a death positive culture, which is this embracing that. And there's a natural tendency and the intention is semi there or have already been there. What about this larger half, right? If someone stumbled upon this episode and they just want to learn more about how they can cope with grief and they might not be as progressive in the way that they have traditionally participated, can you shed some light around that? And yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Sure. I mean, I think, so now we are focused on this platform around growth and healing. And I facilitate these groups which have a curriculum that lead people through different like creative exercises and reflections and small group, discussions. And I will say that the assortment of people that are in that group, this is very
Hmm.
fresh. They've recently experienced some type of loss, and it might be the first big loss that they've had. And so I just want to say that I there are people in the group that are, have perhaps lost somebody many years ago or have gone through something hard a while ago, and they're more maybe comfortable in it. And I think that this idea of meeting people where they're at, and kind of this idea of an invitation, and we have like this, we have a saying of like taking small sweet steps, is that for somebody who is new to this, it's like maybe not being part of a group right away is the right, step. Like, I mean, and for Reimagine, we have like lots of free online events that you can attend. And so that's like we host a vigil each
Hmm.
month where we get
Hmm.
different authors and poets and musicians to come and talk about their work in relationship to grief. And we do an honor ceremony so everyone can honor the person, that or things that they want, that they're grieving in the chat, and we light a candle, and it's so gentle. And, I think that, and in my groups, it's like, for example, in the 10-week long program, people do an independent project of their choice that's sparked by whatever loss or hardship that is bringing them there, and designed to cultivate whatever growth or meaning they're looking for. And for some people, that project is more of a real project, and they like are, whether it's an artistic venture or community service or a writing project. But for others, like for example, one woman had recently lost her husband, and she used to cook dinner for him, and she was having a hard time taking care of herself and cooking for herself. So her project became cooking one of his favorite recipes a week, and then sharing that with some other like people, neighbors. And
That's right.
so it's like there, I guess, and, the impact of her project was just as impactful as somebody who was doing something bigger. And because really it was a lesson for her to follow her own heart, listen to her heart, and follow what it needed. And it was just like she just needed to take the tiniest steps. And so I think that part of it is that people's like misunderstanding that like when you go into grief, it's like you have to like literally jump in like head first. And I think that there's a lot of tools out there and a lot of conversations and a lot of art. I mean, I'm a big proponent of like art and music and different things to kind of create that gateway. And I think the events that we host are a lovely way for people to kind of step in. And
Yeah.
then
Thank
if
you
they
so
are
much for
interested in
sharing
going
that.
deeper with
And
their
it's
own grief
and
work, we
also
also have
understanding
programs
kind
to
of, you know,
support them with
this
that
there
and a
to
platform.
me it's an epidemic almost, right? Because as you're saying this, sharing recipes and exchanging that with the neighbors and the community, I can see my mom doing that. And she's a slightly private person, she's introverted, but my dad, I just cannot. There's absolutely no way. Everything is in private, right? The emotions are just kind of not shown, and I think that's a huge representation of this male versus female way of dealing with grief, and even generationally, boomer versus millennial, and, Gen X, Gen Y, and, I'm sure Gen Z as well have a different coping mechanism just because the digital era and how that translates. I absolutely love the invitation element, but just even to peel that back a little bit for those people that are open, and that is a huge population of this country, what do you suggest them to do? Or maybe even the people around them to do, right? How do we help this population, right? Because they'll never speak out loud. And it's almost like, okay, it seems like they're coping with it, but absolutely maybe they're not. They're suppressing it, or they're just not dealing with it. So maybe it's not even observed, right? And to even incentivize that invitation from the relatives and colleagues.
Yes. Well, and I'll speak from my personal experience. I'll also just mention that what is exciting to me in the Reimagine community is that the demographic is quite diverse in terms of age. That, there are people in their 80s, there are people in their 20s who show up. And so and the kinds of conversations are happening intergenerationally, and that's something that we're trying to facilitate. Now, as somebody in my family, I am definitely the emotional one. I'm definitely the like talk about anything this. I do believe in the power of modeling, and that even if somebody doesn't necessarily respond, you demonstrating or sharing your experience or just saying, I'm feeling these feelings, and perhaps asking if they want to share, but not forcing it. I think over time that does make a difference. I guess it's like with, I mean, I would say to the people that may be listening to this that are just like, "Ah, hell no, I don't want to I don't want to talk about this," is that my assumption is that the impression of what these conversations are like, or how this is going to feel, or how you're going to feel afterwards, is what's preventing, like, there's a lot of fears, and I would say mischaracterizations or of like what it's like. Because at the end of the day, like when I'm in these groups, like I just did a group today, it's like, sure, like people shared some hard stuff and I felt it. But you know what? We also giggled. We also had these like moments of sharing. And it's also like what I say to people is like you can share at whatever level of specificity you want as long as it's authentic. And I think that there's simply like naming something, even in it doesn't have to be super specific, but if you do that and you do it a little and a little and a little, it does open it up. And I think listening to podcasts like this and reading books, memoirs of people that are going through something that you may relate to, it's just there the normalizing of this is not going to happen like that. It's like when you talk about culture change, it's like a whole number of little things that start to create a safer container for people to like expand the container for people to like open up and do. And I think we each can have a role in that. And it can be, it's like, even crying, right? And showing crying. And when a man cries and does that, it's like that, and the more that like boys see that as like being a sort of normal thing, like fathers demonstrating that they can have like sad feelings and express them,
Yeah,
I think that
absolutely.
all of
Thank you for
that is
sharing that.
going to
And
over time open things up.
yeah, again, I was just the whole time you were speaking, I was just putting myself in my parents' shoes and thinking how it's changed, right? And I think the danger of all of us is that we assume that the person who is quiet is fine, or, some people may cry, some people plan, but some people are silent. But that can all be grief, right? And it really shows up in different forms. So if you're in that collective group of either a relative, a sibling, or friend, or a church pastor, what you can do, it sounds like, is just kind of showing up and extending an invitation in a non-judgmental way, and that could just be a very gentle first step. And yeah.
And I'll say too that so I used to be on the board of this wonderful organization called Help Each Other Out, that was started by this woman, Kelsey Crow, who's a social scientist. And she did a study of what helped people during hard times and basically asking people. And she did surveys, I think, of thousands of people. And she wrote a book called There's No Good Card for This, where she tried to distill the learnings. And I think that in terms of when somebody's going through, a hard time, and you want to support them. One is looking at like how ways in which you are comfortable in showing up. So it's kind of like you don't, as an example, if you don't like to cook, like don't make the casserole, like buy the casserole if you want to, but show up in ways that that feel good to you, because if you are just trying to do something you're supposed to do, that's not going to feel good. The other thing is that you can check in with people in a way that is not like obtrusive or forceful. I think that it's like even simply sending a text of like just saying hi, thinking of you, here if you want to talk, taking somebody on a walk. When you're talking about like men in particular, like I
Oh, I
remember, I
like
mean, this was years ago, but with the dinner party, we did an experiment with like CrossFit, like having a CrossFit men's group that was like talking about grief. Because the idea is that men feel more comfortable. It's like, for example, if a comparison of like grilling something at a party, that men will talk around the grill, but in their grilling, they're doing something, but they're talking. It's like, so there is something about, in particular, I mean, of what I've read, and it's like with men, to make it a little easier, is that there maybe is some type of activity that is around it. And I think that's also with like having comedy shows about grief, or
yes.
going to a concert where maybe the musician is exploring topics of loss. It's like, it just is a little bit less like in your face. Like, I want to talk about this. It's like, how can you create environments and
Absolutely. Thank you
opportunities
so
and
much for sharing that. I
activities
think
that
that's
might
something
lend
so
to opening up these
applicable,
kinds of
right?
conversations?
And as you were saying that, I remembered a story about a couple of years ago. A really good friend of mine, her neighbors, it was an engaged couple, and then her fiance was, drowned. And this is like on the news too. And she, was engaged one weekend. And when she came back from this engagement weekend, not only lost her fiance, but just everything, right? And the way that she recovered from that and gone through the 7 stages of grief is something that I love to dive a little bit deeper into and share a few stats that I find super fascinating, right? So 7 stages of grief is shock, denial, anger, bargaining, and depression, then testing and acceptance. And as you can see, it's a very complicated range of emotions. And what some stats that I found super fascinating is that with the spouse loss, right, it can affect physical survival as well. There was a Harvard health study that came out that they found the widowhood effect was the strongest in the first 3 months after a spouse dies, which shockingly has a tag of 66% increased chance of dying in that period. And oftentimes you see that, right? Not only showing up when, grandpa passes away, grandma very shortly within a couple of months followed, despite of very healthy stats that shouldn't have terminated her lifespan. I loved for you to expand a little bit more if you have knowledge around that, because the follow-up question to it is our system, right? Given the complexity and given the health tag that kind of comes with that, is that the standard company policy that give our workers is that they give only 3 days, right? 3 to 4 days for an immediate family member. And that's not something that's really long enough to reorganize someone's entire life, right? Can you shed some light around this if you have?
Yeah, I mean, I where it comes up for me a lot is that in the groups that I run, there's a lot of caregivers. So people who are actively caregiving, either in a professional sense, like death doulas or serious illness care doctors, or, but then there's a lot of people who are caring for their loved one, often a partner, but sometimes a child who has a serious illness. And, there was a study that came out recently about the health impacts of on caregivers,
Which
and
is one in
how
four
you're like,
Americans,
if
actually.
if you're a
That's
long-term
insane amount of
caregiver,
number.
you're and how, the risk of serious illness, death, like, increases a lot because, I mean, the amount of pressure that is put on caregivers to, it's like failings of the healthcare system, where in part it's just the healthcare system is so challenging to navigate. So it's like there's like actually getting that person to the doctors and keeping track of all of it. But then there's also fighting to get that doctor to see your loved one in time and getting the right medications approved by the insurance. And, it's like there's like it's going to be hard, but it's like the level of what people are holding and navigating, and also I mean, the exhaustion too. I mean, if you, you're staying up, your hours are, you have to tend to somebody. And what also happens then in the aftermath of after their loved one has passed is that there's an identity loss too. Because they become, there was an identity loss of when they became the caregiver, that they had to let go of other parts of their life often because they just don't have the time or energy. Then when the person passes, then their, identity has been so much become the caregiving. And then it's like, well, who am I now? And then there's obviously just like the profound grief of losing that loved one. And then there's, family dynamics, right, that are also coming into play, like who was more of a caregiver, who and it's kind of like there's the dynamic of when you're in the fire of dealing with it, and then there's the fire afterwards, because there's a little bit of reckoning about, wait, why, if you're the child and you've got a couple other siblings and they're not pitching in as much as you did, and then, there's just the complexity of this, and the fact that the healthcare system does not provide enough support for either the person that is is dealing with the illness, and then the people that are supporting them. And then because the system is so broken and so bifurcated, and, it's like there's so much fighting for things that happen. And then you obviously the great financial implications, because often, it's like a caregiver doesn't have time to work, right? So then it's like, how is that family being supported?
I would love to just stay on
And
topic of
so,
this
no,
too.
I
I
mean,
mean,
I guess I have a lot
I'm
to say about
fascinating
this.
and so glad that you brought up this word caregivers, because, one thing that I'm immediately thinking to is that, again, caregivers come and go in different shapes, right? They don't have to be an immediate family member who's a caregiver. You mentioned a death doula could be a caregiver. What other identities or IDs that, we would know those titles to be that also qualify as a caregiver? Mhm.
I mean,
Could be
a
medical,
caregiver, I mean,
non-medical,
it's like
relative.
a parent. I mean, medical could be like you're a social worker. I mean, I could potentially be described as one in the sense of like holding space for people in grief. It's like there are so many people, I mean, all frontline workers in some ways, like a teacher, right? Like when you think about people that are not just, I mean, there's like the tactical stuff that they have to handle in their work, but where there's an emotional component of emotional health component where, you can think about even, when you go to the hospital,
Yeah.
every single person that you come in and interact with.
This is
And even, I mean, honestly, like, I mean, I don't think they would describe themselves as a caregiver, but this came up in one of my groups where we were talking about kind of holding space for others, and she's a flight attendant. And we were talking about how, like, when you think about, I mean, even in my experience, I was in Australia when I got the call that my mom was dying. I had to do a 22-hour flight home. The care that the stewardess, like, took, right, like, with me, knowing that, like, my mom had died, like, that it's like, there's these people that are holding the weight of so much, like, when you think about an airport, it's you're transitioning. You're going through a transition, even if it's a something joyful that you're about to go to, there's, like, that anticipation that, like, there's just a lot, but there's so much loss in the
yeah.
airport comes together, right? Because you have to fly across the country because somebody died or somebody's sick. And thinking about how people, even if like maybe their job, it's not in their job description, but they are holding something. They are holding a really sacred space for people as they transition through hard things. And I think it's when I think society breaks down is when people are holding so much weight themselves in their own personal like life, or they're not getting paid enough, or they're like having to hold so much and navigate such hard systems that they may not have capacity to hold others, right? And when we don't have capacity to hold others, it's like all of those touch points, all of those things become hard and rough, and then that's absorbed. I mean, you feel it on the roads. I live in LA now. It's like people are holding a lot of rage, a lot of grief, and it's like it comes out in various ways. And so to me, like having healthcare systems and structures and treating the workers and paying them well and giving them the kinds of emotional support. I mean, that's where like we've done programs with serious illness care doctors and doulas. And like you need space if you're navigating grief in your job. You need to have space to process that. It's inhuman, frankly, to make people be interacting with loss and grief and death on a daily basis and not give them space to actually process that pain and grief. And why I'm so excited about the work that Reimagine is doing is that how can you actually translate that into more love and more like empathy, and so that it actually goes back into the community too. It's not just, it's like by creating spaces for people to process and to care for
Absolutely. I
themselves,
mean,
it's like that
you
compassion
absolutely opened
then
up
can
a
lend
can of
out to the
emotions,
people that they're taking care of.
both you and I, and wow, what an underserved set of community, right? Like, and I don't even think the caregivers themselves that are holding space for you, like the flight attendant, is even aware that she's participating in this caregiver role. That served so significant for you at the time, hindsight, and in that way. And I love to understand, like, I didn't even think that, the identity of this caregiver group is so large. What type of resource can we offer them, right? We've been talking about how do we offer people who are grieving, but like the caregivers, you're right. They're sort of the center on anticipatory grief. They are participating in their own daily, life survival. On top of it, coordinating the logistics of the people who are dealing in the active dealing of deaths, right? So there are three components of it. And how can we give back to them? Are there nonprofits? Are there like Reddit groups?
I mean,
Yeah.
I want to.
Okay. Let's
I
talk
mean,
about that.
this Reimagine is focusing a lot on caregivers. So, I think, I mean, there are I'm sure other types of grief support. I think, we are starting to partner with some like hospital, we're working on developing some types of partnerships around that and hospice. And I think and I feel like it's there's kind of like I don't want to say it's three-prong effort, but there's having like public events where people who are in these spaces can come and actually hear other caregivers talk about the
Sure.
need of this and like the kind of how they metabolize and take time to care for themselves and the ways in which they do it and also advocate within their organizations. So, it's like, for example, some of the people that were in this program that we did for serious illness care doctors, one of the big things that came up was like how can the importance of taking time during the workday, even if it's literally 30 seconds to like if somebody they went through a hard moment with a patient, somebody passed, but the power of just a pause and a moment to acknowledge what has happened and to like breathe. It's like, I mean, there are bigger things, right? Giving spaces for people to talk about this and connect with other doctors in a safe way or other types of healthcare workers, nurses, whoever it is, right? People who are working in all different types of capacities in these like, challenging spaces where they feel safe being able to share some of the things that they're carrying. Because I think a lot of times people in these professions, they don't want to look like they're not a team player. They don't want to like there's also this like guilt that they may feel that it's like, well, I'm not the patient, right? Like I'm not like they're going through something really hard. I can suck it up and I can do it. But the problem is over time, kind of sucking things up like leads to burnout and ultimately is going to impact your ability to be compassionate with the people that you're serving. And I mean, for me, like, I did Teach for America right after, like, just about a year after my mom passed. And I was still very much grieving. I was still caring a lot. And then I'm teaching in a school where there was kids were dealing with so much more than me, like whether it be loss, or poverty, violence, it was just a lot. And I felt very responsible for, these kids and I felt like, there was a lot on the line and I was not the best classroom manager, but I needed I needed a space to process the grief that I was holding, not just for my mom, but even just in this like really challenging experience where I felt like I was failing every day. And there was a point where I shut down because it was too painful. And I think that for me, a big part in my own healing journey, I don't know if I want to use that word, but my own whatever grief journey is as somebody who's always worked in nonprofits and been very oriented in helping people, is that not like taking the time or money to like work on my own like issues was actually preventing me from showing up fully for the communities I was trying to help. And I think there's something about like shifting the switch in people's brain that they're not being selfish by taking that time to, and I just want to also say the privilege, right? Like of, I, I was able to take time. I had money to put towards therapy and invest in various different types of programs. And I work in this space, so I get exposed to it a lot. But I think that for some people, it's like the because I know I was one of them, it's like this sort of self-sacrificing thing. And I think the more that people can see that actually by taking care of themselves in some way is going to lead to more care for others. And I think that also it's like, I remember one group, we had these women on who they have an organization for children of parents with dementia. And and a big thing that came up often was sort of like, how many phone calls do you take from your parent that just keeps on calling you, or keeps on calling you, keeps on calling you? And, and it's like, what boundaries, you want to be compassionate, but it's also like a lot of this, it's like a long game. And how are you going to keep yourself together and, but making those kinds of decisions. And it's like a moral one, it becomes moral, and not having a space where you can talk about that in a way that you
No,
don't feel
absolutely.
judged,
I think
that
this is a good,
you're making these
reminder. One
decisions.
thing that
Sorry,
you
I know
said
I
so well is
rattled
that the
off. You
power of
can
that
cut.
30-second pause, right? And before that, you were sharing how you guys are collaborating with hospice and hospital. Love to hear some of those initiatives that you're trailblazing in, and how people who, maybe this is an equipment for them to help themselves, right? Because a lot of times we were talking about the community helping where grief as a community experience, but they have to like kind of actualize themselves, right? So please share. Yeah.
Yeah. So, we've done a pilot with Stanford Medical Center with serious illness care doctors. We have done a couple different pilots with the National End of Life Doula Alliance, so working with doulas. And I can't speak to anything specifically because we are in the process of forming these partnerships, but we are in conversations with multiple hospice organizations and hospitals about providing support both for patients or families of patients and also the staff at these organizations, and trying to use our platform where people can do reflections and read other people's stories that are navigating similar things to themselves, that's designed to cultivate post-traumatic growth, which is this idea of channeling these hard parts into meaning and growth. And then also with these group pathways that we have, which are these cohorts that we have both 10-week long and 4-week long experiences that are online. And people can, do an independent project of their choice as they're going through these
Yeah.
experiences
Okay. Thank you so
to
much for sharing. And
cultivate
let's make sure that
more
we'll
growth
drop
and
that link
meaning through these hard
in the bio
situations.
of the episode. So just to kind of summarize, I mean, there's just so much about grief and everything that we talked about. And thank you so much for even opening up. And what I find so refreshing is that this and you are making this whole death and grief experience more approachable, people like you, right? Without making it sound shallow or dismissive. And oftentimes we dismiss ourselves, it sounds like, right? And that's very common to not, again, want to be the burden and all of that. So thank you for building space, right? Where people can talk about grief, death, dying, and everything in between without having to feel that guilt that we're talking about. Because to your point, it's a community experience. So the maybe we can end the episode with the question of, like if someone wanted to make their own family or community just, 10% more honest about death, we're opening up that conversation. If they're not death curious, or maybe they are, what would you tell them to start with? Like just that one step, that first step.
Well, it's funny. The thing that is jumping to mind is one of my friends, Lisa Paul, who I recommend for this show,
Yeah, please make an intro. I love
she
to have
created
her
these
on.
cards
Yeah.
called the Death Deck, and she's wonderful, and these cards have different questions to open up conversations around mortality. And some of them are funny, some of them are more serious, but again, they're really wonderful at creating a gateway in. And I think, that's like a great resource. I think it's also, I think again, people are often feeling isolated
Yes.
in their feelings. There's like the isolation or loneliness pandemic and things like that. And I find, I mean, as somebody who, not just in my day job work, but I'm also do, storytelling and comedy about these kinds of topics, that just either you sharing how you're feeling, that you have, just being able to name that, like, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but it's like saying to one of your loved ones that, like, I love you, and I care about you, and I'm maybe concerned that, I've noticed, X, Y, or Z, or there's something that's like making you feel like, you want to open up a conversation about something that's going on, or just in your own personal that, like, I've been very scared about this, like whatever it is, just naming it and just seeing what the reaction is. I mean, you have to, the thing is, families are, I think, harder to have these conversations with than your friends. And so, one idea too would maybe to be like start with having conversations about this with people that you really feel comfortable with, like really safe with. If you have just one person, or going to a group where people maybe are more comfortable with it so that you become more comfortable with it. So then it's like when you start having a conversation maybe with a family member, it's not the first time you're having that conversation, if that makes sense. I feel like it's like you need to figure out what your slant is. What are your small, sweet steps? And I would start with whatever the most easeful thing, the person,
Yeah,
the going to a
absolutely.
talk, like
I
whatever
really
just
like that,
feels
and
like,
honestly,
that's
I
not
was
that big of
even
a deal. I
thinking
can do
about
that.
maybe like a mini series or a mini movement where it's like wine Wednesdays, right? Like just grab a glass of wine, you sit at a dinner table with your family, and that's when you kind of spill the bean and talk a little bit more about the stuff that you've been putting off and you just don't kind of want to talk about. Yeah. I would be yes.
Well, I do wanna do another plug just because you said the Wine Wednesdays, is that my other friend who, Stephanie Elkins, who runs Death Over Drafts, and she's wonderful, I recommend her as well. Her and Lisa actually partner on these events where at breweries, they have it's like conversations about death, and they use the death deck, but then she'll sometimes have speakers and, kind of just to open up the conversations, and then it's super casual, like, people are just sitting, and you don't have to drink, but you could drink and
Okay,
eating,
so
and then you're
I
just kind
like
of going
now
around
that I'm
talking
hearing
in these
because there's
small
just so
groups.
many of these like micro movements. I had no idea. I mean, I've heard about the death deck, death over drafts, first time hearing it. There's Reimagine, there's the dinner party, there's death cafes. Is there a central hub where I can find like all of these little micro movements and local things where maybe a family can just step in and
We do have like a resources kind of hub where you can find some of these things. I know that they're also like, for example, Claire Bidwell Smith. She is a therapist who we've done programs with, and she has on her website a great like resource list that also has different organizations and books and speakers and things like that that I would recommend. But also we've had so many, I mean, we've had thousands of events on her platform. And so there's also a lot of great people that if you've been just like looking at our speaker list of
yeah,
people that are
absolutely.
running
Okay.
organizations
Sounds
that
good. I
are
think
opening
that's
up
a great
conversations
way
about this.
to